Hello, everyone, and welcome to Municipality, a podcast exploring the wonders of local government through discussions and special guests. I'm Kylie, and I'm here today with Matthew to talk about a really relevant topic as college students head back to campus for the fall. Where am I going to live? And a quick follow-up question, how much is it going to cost me? Matthew and I are going to share some of our own experiences with how local government intersects with the cost of housing for university students in today's episode, titled Local Government and Affordable Housing for Students.
Thank you, Kylie, for the introduction. And I think for our listeners, we first kind of want to explain what exactly affordable housing is, because I know pretty much, I started working on these issues about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and I'd always heard the term affordable housing, but I never really knew, okay, past the talking points, what exactly is affordable housing and what does it mean? So basically the Department of Housing and Urban Development, otherwise known as HUD, they define affordable housing as housing that costs 30% or less of a household's income. However, looking at students, I'm sure many of our listeners who are students can relate, that's really hard to quantify because not all of us have full-time jobs that have an income that can come within this range.
Definitely. Yeah, one of the first questions I had when you brought up that definition to me, Matthew, was like, how do I know, am I my own household? Am I my parents' household? Do I even have a full-time job that qualifies for that definition? And personally, my answer is no. I work part-time during the school year, maybe full-time during an internship during the summer. And between the school year and the summer, I'm likely living in 2 or 3 different places. And the one thing I do know is that my university charges a really high rent price for room and board in dorms. So for me personally, I actually didn't live in a dorm my freshman year of college, and that was really driven by the fact that I wanted to save some money. I ended up living in a co-ed fraternity house, more running as a co-op my freshman year, and it was about half the cost total of the university-run dorm and meal plan, and that was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I spent my first year of college. Then, after transferring to Cornell, I did live in university dorms, but it was only because that cost was kind of wrapped into my tuition and financial aid offer, and I also just didn't know the area very well, and I needed a place to live, being someone who was admitted kind of late as a transfer student. What's been your experience, Matthew?
Yeah, in my freshman year, I lived in the dorms at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I was paying about $960 a month, and that was in one of the cheaper dorms too. And on top of that, they threw in a mandatory meal plan that you had to spend a certain amount of money on, which increased those costs even more. So quickly after my first year, some friends and I realized this is just ridiculous. We went and got an apartment. Rent went about in half to around $560 a month, which was great until COVID hit. And long story short, our landlord, and we'll talk about this a little later in the episode, was not giving us any sort of break or assistance in any regards. And it really hurt 2 of my roommates who are international students, even though they potentially, for a time, were thinking they may not even be able to come back into the country. They were still required to pay for a unit that they weren't living in. And again, I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself. We'll talk a bit more about that. But, back to the whole point about having students' income hard to quantify. As I prepare to go to graduate school, I'm going to be on my own with a lot of living costs, particularly housing. And since I'm not going to have a full-time job, even if I needed it, I would not even be eligible to qualify for any sort of affordable housing or student-friendly housing. And a lot of the places I'm looking at, whether that be Seattle, where I could potentially go to for grad school, housing is really, really expensive. And there just doesn't seem to be a lot of options for students who are already taking out loans, who are already having to live cheaply. And we hope in this episode, because we want to recognize affordable housing impacts others in disproportionate ways. We're going to focus this episode kind of more on students, as that's the perspective Kylie and I have. And then we're thinking in the later episode, we're going to bring on some housing experts to talk about what affordable housing looks like in a more broad range.
Definitely. Yeah. We definitely want to have a multi-episode conversation about this, just because affordable housing is really not the simple issue that a lot of people paint it as. And it requires like a whole toolbox, a whole slew of different solutions for different types of affordable housing problems. So today we did want to talk about, like Matthew said, some of the specific affordable housing things and problems that students are facing. And I know many of our students in the audience know this already, but like we touched on, housing can cost almost $10,000 through a university just for like the 8 or 9 months that we're on campus. And sometimes when students live off campus, they are being forced to sign leases that either run the entire year, even in the summer when they're not there to live, but they still have to pay, or specifically now in COVID, we're being stuck signing leases and there's no way out for a lot of students. Matthew, did you say you had experience with that?
Yep, and we're going through that right now. And actually, with my lease, one of the other co-hosts in this podcast, Adrian, might be subleasing with me, which would really, really help some of my roommates who, one of my roommates is in China, and for him to get back in the country, he'd have to quarantine in a country outside of Asia for a full 2 weeks, which that again leads to another cost. Where are you going to live? Where are you going to stay for those 2 weeks? So definitely this is something I'm feeling right now, and I'm sure many other people are as well. And also I really wanted to mention, Kylie, if I have a quick minute, just about just the whole topic of affordable housing. I think it's important to recognize too how affordable housing is linked with homelessness. And obviously that's not something that, I'm directly facing, and I'm really appreciative and thankful that that's the case. But this summer I've been interning in the mayor's office, and the city of Los Angeles has arguably the worst homeless crisis in the country, where you have close to 50,000 people on the streets, around 11,000 of which are children. It's all tied with affordable housing. And again, like Kylie was saying, it's a toolbox approach where there's not a one size fits all approach, because if you're looking at, okay, how can we make affordable housing for students, is a much different conversation than, okay, how do we expedite the construction and development process and rapidly rehouse, whether that be through a temporary permanent supportive housing structure, Project Room Key is an initiative the state of California has done to temporarily house families in hotels. How do we do that? Or how do we just make housing more focused on students? So, I think that was just a really good point, Kylie, you were making about that kind of toolbox approach.
Yeah. And the way you brought up hotels there, that's actually something that a lot of students returning to Cornell, where I go to school, are kind of thinking about and being forced to grapple with. So Matthew, you brought up the 2-week quarantine for your roommate who is abroad, international right now. And I'm not sure if y'all know, but the state of New York has this list of states where you need to also quarantine for 2 weeks after entering the state again. So I am in Wisconsin right now, and Wisconsin is on that list. So if I would choose to go back to my university in person for the fall, which is an option available to me, my university is staying open, I would then need to personally pay for and find a hotel room or an Airbnb or some relative or friend that I maybe have, but personally I don't. Anyways, I would need to find one of those solutions, finance staying there for 2 weeks independently, and then come to Cornell campus and move into any of my local housing options under some really kind of restrictive but kind of necessary guidelines for testing and quarantining that the university has put in place. So that obviously is another financial expense that students are kind of being saddled with, in addition to the cost of their actual residence once they surpass the quarantine, get tested, test negative, et cetera, et cetera. So that is just one more issue that students are facing as they grapple with and maybe think about returning to their campus in the fall.
Yeah, and actually, Kylie, actually before this call this morning, I briefly went on the website Zillow, which it's not an academic website. So if you're trying to do a study or anything, I wouldn't use Zillow, but it's a really good website to see what the going rates are for rents in your own community. where you're living. So as I'm preparing to potentially negotiate with my landlord and try to, see if we can get a better rate, I was looking at what, the going rates are across the city, and I was shocked. There's such a low vacancy rate. There's very few things that are available, and the units that are available, it's over 800 a month, which doesn't really give us much bargaining power, because I think paying $565 a month is not too bad. But that it shows that even during COVID, there's not a ton of options for students. And something I want to briefly mention too is we briefly mentioned the definition of what affordable housing is, and that if the 30% income qualifier, that allows you to then be eligible for certain assistance programs, whether that be Section 8 vouchers, whether that be through, like, the city of Los Angeles just implemented an emergency rentals assistance program, which is all really important things. But again, that's for people who have full-time jobs, who aren't students. And I think it's important to recognize, that obviously I think there's people out there that need affordable housing way more than students. And I think we need to recognize that. But a lot of these people who are reliant on Section 8 vouchers, who are reliant on these public housing programs, if they had these resources available to them as students, because as students, to get a good job, you're expected to go to a good university, which means you may have to take out loans, especially with graduate school being more prevalent. And if you are able to save more now as a student, on top of all those other costs you're already having to pay, you may be less reliant. And it would be interesting to look at a study on this later, but you could be less reliant on these voucher programs. And one other thing I really wanted to quickly mention is the difference between PBV and TBV, which is project-based vouchers, and tenant-based vouchers, which a lot of people talk about. Tenant-based vouchers given directly to you, Section 8, and you may have heard them referred to as housing choice vouchers, because the idea with a Section 8 voucher is certain landlords and developers will qualify their housing as eligible for Section 8, because what was happening in the past is, if you could get a Section 8 voucher, it was kind of grouping all the people who needed the affordable housing together, and it was creating a lot of segregation. So the idea with a Section 8 voucher that's housing choice is you can choose where you want to live. But I think something we need to look at is in tenant-based vouchers, if there are people who are specializing in student housing, which there are developers out there, if they're eligible for some sort of tenant-based voucher, if they're promising the price will be a certain affordability level, it could help students too. It's just I know that was a little long-winded, but just kind of wanted to mention that.
Right. So I'm hearing you almost say that paying a little bit more attention to student housing and how we can make that marginally more affordable might be kind of like preventative medicine for some of these problems that we're facing later, where then we need to work with vouchers and making sure that they're implemented well and implemented fairly. And that puts a big strain on a community as well. So unfortunately, something we're seeing is providing more units of housing near universities, which, great, that sounds amazing. But we're having some problems with the price point of it. And I know that's something that you've done a lot of work with in Madison, Wisconsin. Matthew, do you want to give our listeners a quick intro to the work you've been doing there?
Yeah, and thank you for that great segue. I don't know if our listeners are familiar with Hub 2, which was a very hot topic issue. And I know after I give this little spiel here, I think, Kylie, if you want to share with the listeners your activism around this, I think that would honestly motivate a lot more people to get involved. But Hub 2 was a development that was coming into Langdon Street, which that's actually right, the same street that you were living your freshman year, right?
Yep.
So very close to home. So they were going to build this Core Space as the developer, and they've built other projects in Madison before the Hub, the first version of the Hub, the James, which is another apartment. And these are known as luxury developments, which are massive in scale and that are expensive, with the lowest rent typically hovering around $1,000 and some going upwards of $1,800, which, again, I don't want to judge people who are living there, but I just, to me, it seems unfathomable on top of tuition costs to have to pay practically a mortgage. And there are people in the city of Madison I've spoken to who say that some students are paying higher rents than their own mortgage as homeowners. But anyways, Core Space as a developer wanted to build a third luxury project in Madison on Langdon Street called the Hub 2. And it would have been very expensive. And a number of students expressed concern, we're among them, with the fact that this is a growing trend in Madison. I think we all can agree there needs to be more housing units. There's no denying that. There needs to be greater density. Again, no denying that. But if you constantly build these massive luxury projects, there is an argument more supply will, lessen the demand, which will make prices more fair. However, what we've seen is this kind of influx of massive luxury developments concentrated close to campus, which rises rents in extreme manners that if you want to live close to campus, you're paying an arm and a leg. And some people will point to the numbers and say, well, the net rents are going down. That's true, but that's just because the projects that are farther away from campus, some as far as the city of Monona, which I know a few people who commute that distance, those are the now affordable projects, which are 10, 15 miles away. So, Kylie, I think you could probably explain more on that.
Right. So I was trying to look back at the campus that I went to and attended last year, which was the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Like Matthew said, I lived right on Langdon. I'm very familiar with the area and kind of the housing situation in the area. It's a lot of like Greek houses and some apartment buildings. It's only maybe a half a mile away from the other university dorm buildings. But I was looking back and kind of thinking, what would a huge high cost establishment do in that area? So aside from things like creating congestion and parking and not fitting with kind of the aesthetic and the historic nature of the area, I was looking at what these type of units would do in terms of supply and demand and impact on the market for housing in that area. So like Matthew said, increasing the supply on the surface or on its face is the right move. But I was very concerned that the Hub 2 would raise market prices for housing near the campus, just because all of those units that were supplying to that area would be at such a high price point. So the big concern that I had and why this might not have been a good idea was kind of that the demand for those housing units is relatively inelastic, which means that even though it's a really high price, students would ultimately be forced to succumb to those prices, go into further debt if they needed a place to live, and that's the only place they could find. And some of the reasons that I came to that conclusion were that students really don't have cars a lot of times on campuses. And that means that if this establishment, this high price, high density establishment is really close to campus, there's such a strong incentives to still live there that some might say justifies the high price. But it makes it at the same time really difficult for students because, like I said, they'll either go into more debt to pay for that convenience, or people will point to the more affordable options. But like Matthew said, they're being pushed 10, 15 miles out to Monona. And then you have students who are really kind of disadvantaged in terms of their proximity to campus, their ability to walk to class. They need to have a car then, because public transportation might take a really long time, and all sorts of those issues. So to me, I think that high density developers like this Hub 2 project, they were getting at the right core issue, which is that we need more units of housing, but they were doing it from a point of view that didn't really take into account anyone's interest besides their own, which was this interest to kind of exploit that inelastic demand that I brought up and force students to pay for their housing however they could, whether it was debt or taking on a part-time job or any other innovative solution that students try to come up with, when really the issue is that this housing, like Matthew said, if it's more than a mortgage for a house, it's probably too much to be paying as a renter and as a student for someone who needs to afford this for 4 years, on top of tuition, on top of books and supplies, on top of organization dues and fees to be a part of all the great opportunities a college campus has. And then we just see the situation in which the developers come out on top and students come out in debt. And I think that is the core of this problem for students, particularly when talking about affordable housing. So one of the solutions was kind of trying to get students involved, first to understand these issues and how they're being inversely or adversely affected by them, and also doing things like forming neighborhood associations, speaking at committee meetings. While I was talking and my little monologue there, I was referencing a letter that I wrote and that Matthew actually referenced during his work on a committee. So Matthew, how are things looking in that space, and how can students kind of get involved like you did?
Great question. And your letter was amazing. If any of our viewers head to legistar.com, City of Madison, you go to the Plan Commission, you look up these meetings, you could probably find Kylie's letter, which was next to one of the alder's letters. His name is Patrick Heck, which is pretty cool. But anyways, so essentially the city approval process and committee process is very complex and bureaucratic, and it I believe is done in a way to disenfranchise young people and push certain proposals through, because some of these meetings go 7 hours, 6 hours, and this whole process with the Hub 2, I remember the first meeting I went to with my friend Brandon, it was the Urban Design Commission, where they were looking at the scaling of the building. And of course, our item was agenda item number 9, which would have occurred probably 3 hours after the meeting started. And at the time, that was before COVID was happening. So we had to go somewhere else. So we walked all the way to the city county building, then went to the municipal buildings. That's where the meeting was, because we got lost. But we were sitting in there and someone's like, oh yeah, you'll have to wait 3 to 4 hours. And we had homework, classes, other commitments. So we ended up having to speak in public comments. And there's a thing where in public comments, you can't reference an agenda item, which was an experience. But long story short, is there's going to be barriers in your way if you want to make something happen, whether that be housing related, whether that be public safety, so many different avenues. So a great way, like Kylie said, is just to write a letter, submit it to the relevant city committee, because that's something that is in the, whether it be commissioners, council members, it's in their packet before the meeting. They'll read it, and that way you don't have to sit through a 6-hour meeting. But if you want to speak, it's another great opportunity. And the city of Madison, I'd say, has a really excellent public speaking mechanism during COVID-19. And I personally think that even when the pandemic is over, you should still be allowed to call in meetings and have some sort of component for public comment through there, because I can't tell you how nice it was through this whole Hub 2 process. I could just sit in my living room, have the meeting on in the background while I did other work or spend time with my family. And then when my item was coming up, got all prepared, made my speech, and there it is. And that is just less of a barrier for students to get involved. But over this probably 4 or 5 month process, just 2 weeks ago, this project, the Hub 2, was denied by the Plan Commission. And right now they're going through the process to determine what's going to be on this site. And we got thousands of students to register in opposition for this project. Some even spoke at the meeting. People like Kylie submitted letters. So it was really an experience, and something I'll probably remember for many, many years. And it shows how you can really activate the community around a project, and that ultimately your elected officials will listen to you, because you're a voter and you're their job security. And if you mobilize and come out and enforce, this really showed me that your voice matters. And every single person who spoke, whether it was for the development or against, I could tell their voice was listened to and people cared. So I think to get involved, it's very intimidating. It's something that my heart, even at these meetings, if I attend, will be, racing out of my chest before I speak. And I think as young people, we just need to realize, we have opinions. And even though we may not have the life experience that some of these commissioners or council members have, we have the passion, and these issues are important to us. And if you have those two things and you want to get more involved, and you don't know, if you don't know where to start, just email your city council member or call them, and they can direct you to the appropriate committee and whatnot. But it was definitely a really big victory for us that this project was denied. And I really want to mention too that when it comes to this project, we weren't just saying, we don't want this housing, this is awful. We're just saying, well, we just want this to be more affordable. So something I asked the developer in a meeting was, could you make 20% of the units affordable? I don't think a too big of an ask. And are there certain things you could do to potentially make micro units so you can have more units, and that could potentially lower the cost? So I think it's also important going into these projects is you don't see the big bad developer as an enemy, but rather, they're there for a profit, many of them. There's incentive for them. So what's a solution that you can come to that fits your mold as a community member, but also that of the development community and obviously the other political factors at play?
Definitely. And just to quickly wrap that up, the last 3 words of the letter I wrote were know your constituents. So I think that really encompasses what Matthew is saying there. So this might be kind of a confusing topic, something that you're not super familiar with. So Matthew, I know that you had a little bit of experience and an example of a city who seemed to have done this well. So maybe for some of our listeners who aren't as familiar, what does good look like for this?
Yeah, I'd say that there are a multitude of solutions for this issue. And, I apologize to our listeners if some of this is over their head. And again, we hope in a later episode to clear it up. But I think the issue that Kylie and I brought up at the very beginning of this, the fact that Section 8 vouchers aren't eligible to students, I think that is an issue right then and there. And something really innovative that the Tacoma, Washington Housing Authority did in the Puget Sound region was they partnered with the Tacoma Community College to adjust student restrictions on the qualification for these means entitled programs. So what they did is they took 25 homeless and at-risk students, and they gave them these piloted housing choice vouchers with the stipulation that they'd be enrolled as full-time students. So that really is so innovative, because that is combining what Kylie and I are saying is full-time students. You may be at risk, you may be homeless, but you can't qualify for any of this. They identified those populations, gave them this voucher, and said, as long as you're a full-time student, you're eligible. And that's something that I really think could be expanded to more cities and would be really, really important to have, because there are too many students who are housing insecure. And housing insecure doesn't necessarily mean you're on the streets. It could mean you're couch surfing, living with a friend. And I think in 2016, there was a study, and 12.5% of students in Madison were housing insecure.
Right. And I think that example is such a good solution because, again, it goes back to the know your constituents. Like, we have this Section 8 system that provides assistance for people with full-time jobs. And then we kind of saw that system adapt to people who are full-time students. You're putting in the work, you're doing something, you're being a productive member of the community. And it was a great modification that I think more places could take up to kind of help the students who might be in need.
Yeah, and I think another interesting thing that we haven't even really covered is a housing authority. This is personally one of my favorite solutions, and there's many cities, and I'm sure your city that you're in right now listening to from may have a housing authority, which is this kind of like Ministry of Housing governmental body that is put in charge of, usually by the city, to administer and manage specifically affordable housing projects. And it's public housing, so this is different than the voucher program, but what it is you're eligible typically, again, by a demonstrated need or income to live in these public housing projects. And where I'm from, in the Ventura County region, Many Mansions is a kind of they produce affordable housing. They're not the housing authority, but they produce affordable housing in a really innovative way. But Area Housing Authority is the official housing authority. Probably should have mentioned this before Many Mansions, but they do this administering and management, and oftentimes for the kids in these developments, they have after school programs, tutoring programs, and they're really, really great things. And I think when we're looking at affordable housing too, housing authorities are very important functions of local government.
Definitely. So for today's episode, we did kind of zero in on student impacts and student interactions with affordable housing. But in future episodes, we would really like to kind of zoom out again, maybe get some expert opinions on more different facets of this really complicated issue. So I think that's kind of our hopping off point for today. And the last thing we have, we'll be sure to drop some resources to some of the things we brought up today in the description of this video. And yeah, Matthew, do you want to close up?
Sure, and thank you everyone for joining us. And it was really great to discuss this really complex issue with you all and how it impacts young people and students in so many ways in particular. And like Kylie mentioned earlier, housing is this toolbox approach where there's not a one size fits all approach. You really have to look at all these solutions and be innovative. And I think that's really important. So we definitely look forward to talking about this more. And if you have questions or responses to today's episode, please take a look at the description, like Kylie said, and find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And again, we're happy you joined us today and hope to see you again soon in our municipality.